Just before I start, wanting to acknowledge the ground that we're meeting on. In the Brisbane area, the Jagera and Turrbal people looked after this land for a long, long time, and then white boat people came along and start to make a mess and use up resources quickly. So we've got lots to learn. So acknowledge the elders and the regular people as well. I think I dislike it when I just hear about elders being picked up on rather than the whole collective group. So looking around the room, I know that many of you are probably very well read and versed. So I'm going to go quickly through the background, but I did want to put a very brief background for those who don't know as much, just so that you can read some questions, and it's also on the presentation on the slides. We've heard many times that climate change is the greatest global threat to the 21st century, and the Lancet has been particularly forward and taking a leadership role in there. So, as I said, the background of climate change science, it's really beyond reasonable doubt, despite what we're being told by deniers and so-called skeptics. If you look at the evidence, then there's 99.99% certainty that warming is caused by something rather than just occurring by chance. With 13 of the hottest years ever recorded, it being in the last 15 years. Sorry. That's true. So the probability of this occurring by chance is 1 in 27 million. Plus, there's lots of evidence to support it. We know that carbon dioxide as a molecule vibrates and acts as a greenhouse gas, and that theory is backed up by tracking of temperature rises in line with CO2 concentrations. So I probably need to update the average global temperature increase a little bit higher than that now. With the last few years, it's probably more like 0.9 degrees. So we've known about the actions of certain gases, how they trap heat due to their vibrational nature. And there's others as well as carbon dioxide, including water vapour, methane, nitrous oxide, CFCs, HFCs, and some anaesthetic gases. And Forbes McGain will be talking to us at the conference tomorrow. And some of his work has been looking at selection of anaesthetic gases, which can be thousands of times more potent than CO2 as a climate forcer, thousands of times. So if you get release of gases from the hospital, yes, it's only a small addition to the footprint, but we need to be aware. And another related thing, because it's a medical audience, there was an article in the BMJ last year about asthma puffers, that the gases that they use, although they're not CFCs, because of the Montreal Protocol, they still have quite a potent climate change effect, greenhouse effect. So we probably should be using the dry powder clickers. At first I was resistant to the clickers because I thought this is hard sell and it's throwing away plastic and all that, but now with that awareness I'm going to move across my prescribing habits to prescribe more dry powder rather than the propellant gases, which are thousands of times more potent per gram than a gram of CO2. So I think that we just need education and awareness, and it's an example that we often don't get given that information. How many of you have had a drug rep that's come around from the two companies that flog and tell you about the climate forcing of the gases and that you should be moving across the dry powder devices? I have never heard it, but thank you to the BMJ for alerting me. So we have lots of evidence, lots of indicators of a warming world, sea level rises and decreasing glaciers and snow cover. I've had a number of trips to areas with glaciers, and even in New Zealand, the Fox Glacier has retreated about 1 kilometre since I last went on it with my kids and did a glacier walk about 15 years ago. It's retreated about 1 kilometre further in that 15 years. It's quite frightening, really. And now you can no longer walk to the front because it's too unstable. You have to pay a lot more to get flown up to the top. And there's a cost to all of this, of course. We'll talk about the health costs soon, but the extreme weather costs. So it's strange why we can't change, why despite all this evidence, that business as usual continues. So this is my question. The evidence is really clear. Why is it not more widely accepted? And I'll just run through these slides, then if we want to pause for a little while and reflect on that, have a few comments, that's probably a suitable way to do it. I like to teach with graphics. I think it's... The choice of the film name, An Inconvenient Truth, I think was very clever, especially when you look at the alternatives. A reassuring lie. Yeah. We're going to be hearing from John Cook today in the other stream. Okay. He's done a lot of work and published on climate skepticism and denial. So that's going to be interesting that we can unpack this in more detail. So we don't need to spend a huge amount of time at the moment on it. But I'm just trying to give you an overview.
Well, we do have a lot of, shall I say, liberal voters amongst our colleagues that perhaps don't fully support your views. And have you noticed that? Certainly where I work with Marta Private, I've got quite a number.
Mm-hmm. Yes, it's become politicised, more so in Australia and the US than Europe. And the interesting thing is that techniques used, this book by Naomi Oreskes was very salutary in uncovering the techniques were similar to the big tobacco used, the big fossil fuels, big oil and coal, hired even the same PR companies to create doubt, to like was done with cigarettes, that, oh, you don't have RCTs, you don't have the evidence, cigarettes don't, we don't know that they cause lung cancer, etc. That delayed action for decades, and so the same techniques are being used. So, quote from Naomi Klein here: lowering emissions in line with science-based targets will mean forcing some of the most profitable and powerful companies on the planet to give up trillions of dollars of future earnings by leaving the vast majority of fossil fuel reserves in the ground. And so that's the difficulty, I think. We're working against entrenched interests. I've got a quiz of 6 questions, but did anyone want to respond to, or did you want to pose a question? Or?
Is there any questions for David or comments on that, on what he's presented so far? Otherwise we'll do your quiz.
Okay. Okay, so the first one's a true false. I don't know that I need to embarrass people, do I? With hands? And the others are ABC, 3 option multi-choice.
I'm pretty sure that was true.
Did feel quite hot.
It wasn't as hot. It wasn't as hot in the southern hemisphere. The northern hemisphere was much hotter than the southern hemisphere. They really didn't have much of a winter. So yes, true. But how much hotter was it above the long-term average?
I'll go for the middle one, 1.1.
No. January was 1.1. February was 1.32. It was 0.2. It was just over 0.2 degrees higher than smashed the record. That's a huge increase for a monthly average above the mean to smash the record by 0.2 of a degree C. It's frightening, and we really need to understand that the jump in speed of warming, just sure, it's combined with an El Nino effect, and that's what happened in '98 with the big warmth there, and then that warming seemed to slow down. But the amount of change, despite January also being El Nino, it really is quite frightening, and we could be seeing it accelerating further over the next few years.
And with climate change, it's predicted that winters will heat up more than summers will anyway. So
yeah.
That all makes
So
sense.
we've got a target of 2 degrees to aim for, but Paris said we should aspire for 1.5 degrees, and there's inertia in the system. The carbon that's already there, plus what we're adding, because we can't switch off our coal-fired generators immediately and electrify our transport fleet overnight. So what does that mean? Are we going to get to stop at 1.5? It doesn't look like it, although maybe in non-El Nino years, in La Nino years, we might be fine. Sea level rises. We'll let someone else have a go on, Andrew. And what do you reckon?
I think we've jumped to 3 millimetres in
3, yeah. So 3 millimetres is only tiny. When people say, oh, 3 millimetres, how much is that a decade? 3 centimetres. So over a few decades. And if it speeds up further, because we've already increased from 2 to 3, so if that pace of change goes to 4 and then 5, by the end of the century, conservative estimates, without collapse of ice shelves, you're still looking at half a metre or so, 0.3 of a metre, but we're likely to speed up, if you're looking at compounding.
And the inundation per centimetre, is it 10 metres per centimetre or so? It's huge, land loss.
Oh, yes. Yeah. Since the scrapping of the carbon price in Australia, electricity emissions have risen by how much? A bit over 5% in a year and a half or something. Whereas they were actually decreasing even before the carbon price. The national electricity market had been flat for a few years due to people taking up energy efficiency. So once you get more brown coal-fired power stations back online, where emissions are going up again, despite we're meant to be reducing for Paris Accords coming up, etc. Methane is how many more times potent than CO2? This is a bit of a trick question.
It depends over what time period.
Yes. So I better give you the answer to this one. People often quote 21, but if looking at the references, it's thought that was reduced to 21 because of the shorter 20-year frame rather than a 100-year time frame. That really it's 56 times or more for year by year. So if you're looking at what's going to happen over the next decade, it's more likely 50 plus times. Future impacts of climate change. If we go on with business as usual, you can see the timescale on the bottom of the graph there. Over from 20,000 years BC to 4,000 years into the future, that the Holocene, that 10,000 or so year period of stability when agriculture flourished, was actually within a band of 1 degree C. That was the deviation for global averages, apart from the tiny little blips that might have just exceeded it, that some of the deniers like to talk about. And on the same graph, in this short time scale, if we go up 3 degrees, we're right out of this comfort zone for the Earth, for the stability of the climate and for agricultural systems and everything. So 2 degrees is considered the safe zone, although that was arbitrary, just picking 2 as a nice round number. We don't actually know that. So you can see it's going to be major shifts for the whole planet and the climate. Projected temperature increases by 2030 in Australia from CSIRO. This is up to 5 degrees here hotter in places with the darkest area, 5 degrees here for parts of WA that are already very hot.
2030 or 2090?
2090. So if this is business as usual, projected, hopefully that doesn't happen, but can you imagine if some of these areas here are even 4 degrees hotter? Average temperatures, that's going to be quite massive to cope with, to adapt to. And for those who like their wine, it's predicted that 73% of Australian land used for viticulture could become unsuitable by 2050. So we'd better drink up tonight.
Does that include everybody moving to Tasmania?
The problem is Tasmania is going through long-term drying trends, and as you know from the fires and the massive drought, so although it'll be suitable temperature-wise for growing grapes, although if everyone moves, they might live on grape-growing land. But I'm sure that grapes can grow in dry climates, but the uncertainty, instability can still affect crops.
I think sherry grows well in dry climates.
Change our drinking habits. No, but sometimes things that make it a point to people, to little things that affect it, what they take for granted in their lives, can be quite powerful.
But it also illustrates that you need to take a systemic response to the issue. You just don't think grapes temperature, you have to think grapes whole system.
Yeah.
Water and land use and
Soil.
bushfires, and bushfires affects the quality of the grapes. They have a smoky flavour. No, after the big Canberra fires, a lot of the harvest was dumped because the smoke was coming through in the wine. The big Canberra fires from 4 or 5 years ago. Yeah. Okay, future risks that the IPCC looked at for climate change by 2050, biodiversity loss, extinctions, extreme weather events. We know all these, but health is what we're going to target in this talk. And of course what we're worried about is feedback and tipping points, especially above 2 degrees C, as people have pointed out there with the methane release from permafrost that someone just mentioned, and the CO2 absorption by the ocean. It's doing quite a good job taking up a lot of CO2, but there may be a point where it's not able to take up as much, and forests are dying, and then there's less forests to take up the CO2, and less ice means less reflection of sunlight back up into the atmosphere.
And CO2 absorption.
CO2 absorption, of course, it acidifies the oceans, and that interferes with calcification.
Yes.
And that can upset a lot of marine ecosystems.
Yes.
And the CO2 is temperature dependent, so the hotter the water gets, the less CO2.
So there's a lot of non-linear systems that it's really hard to predict, but many of the changes are already faster than predictions. And the coral bleaching was one example that we saw in the Barrier Reef this summer. So climate change is just one of many environmental challenges and risks. I just want to quickly show that we can look at climate change, but there's actually a number of planetary boundaries. We look at 9 different planetary boundaries here, and as Peter said as well, we need to look at the whole ecosystems and the whole systems approach, that we're also pushing the boundaries, as it were, pushing the limits with a number of our others, like the phosphate and nitrogen cycle, water tables dropping. And so the climate change, loss of biosphere integrity, biodiversity, species extinctions and land system changes and altered phosphorus and nitrogen cycle. And Australia has low phosphate soils, so we need phosphates to grow our food, and the world's running out of phosphates. Nauru's mined it all and shipped it off, and has refugees instead to get an income because they've used all their phosphates. So we are really at risk that we're going to have a less hospitable Earth to live on, and that will affect human well-being. And it's thought that climate change is going to reverse some of the gains that we've made in the Millennium Development Goals with reducing poverty. So why is this happening? Well, a lot of it is because we're using up resources unsustainably. World Wildlife Fund has a date each year that they've said that we've used up all of the renewable. We've going into debt on our credit card, our ecological credit card, and it's to about August now. I remember a few years ago it was September and then October, a point at which we've used all of the soil and the trees, and then after that we're using them faster than they can regenerate. So we're maxing our ecological credit card. And we're going to hear later about world population, so I won't go into it a lot, but there's a lot of pressure on the world with resources because there's just more and more mouths to feed and to house. So as we know that medicine has been part of reducing death rates, and birth rates have dropped as well, but people are living longer, and it's probably a good thing that we're allowing people to live longer, but in the last 100 years populations have greatly increased, and we also consume a lot more, to the point where they're actually suggesting coining a new epoch called the Anthropocene to follow the stable Holocene, because there's actually geological evidence that will be seen in geological stratas thousands of years from now. When people go, they'll be able to say, oh, look, here there's all these plastics, and there's evidence that there was a warmer world, and there's all this human detritus, and actually within geological strata, sedimentary rock, it'll be signs of a different epoch. that the Anthropocene is the epoch to, and this is getting support that it's become accepted in geology, world geological circles as a term for an actual new age to follow the stable Holocene.
But even if it's not accepted by the geologists who have control of this thing, it's an incredibly useful framing for our conversation.
That it's humans that are the main dominant changer of the Earth. That
So-
our impact is being seen in the oceans, in the soils, everywhere.
So it might be
Yeah.
a social definition, not a geological definition, but it's a very useful one.
And it's possibly because of how we treat the world as there to be exploited and abused. This is a photo of a boy picking out straws for recycling from Manila Bay. That's junk floating on the surface of Manila Bay. And it's our economic system, as many of you know, that is likely to be underlying much of this, the way that big companies are treated as individuals and don't have and just have the responsibility to make profits rather than to care for the earth. And externalities here that economic measures really don't factor in, despite some triple bottom line accounting efforts, the impact on the environment. And so coal is seen as a cheap fuel, but if you look at the full cost in all of the externalities to the environment and health, it's about 3 times the cost of what we pay per kilowatt hour or per tonne for the total cost of the damage that it does, as well as the cost to dig it up. And trickle-down economics isn't working. I think there's another factor that there's 81 individuals, well, families that are richer than the 50% of the rest of the world.
Now.
Is it 67? It was 80 something.
It was
Okay.
82, it was
81. 81.
Years ago,
Yeah.
it's now 67.
Yeah. So the inequality is increasing, and maybe this is part of our problem. And you could say, what's this got to do with medicine and health? Well, this is the structure. How many people are up that end of the room for the structural system? And our economic system is part of that structure. I love this quote from Kenneth Boulding, who was a Quaker Nobel Prize-winning economist. Anyone who believes in indefinite growth in anything physical on a physically finite planet is either mad or an economist. And really, they'd say the economy or the environment, but you can't have one without the other, as New Age-ish sort of poster about the Cree Indian leader saying you can't eat money, or what are you going to eat when all the rivers are going to go. Okay, so that's end of part 1. So I think this is a really critical key that you need to understand. The carbon budget, how much we've got left to play with up our sleeve before we get to those tipping points above 2 degrees. And many of you will know it, but for those who don't, I'm just wanting to very quickly make sure that this is covered, because I think this is how you can explain it to other people about a carbon budget. Remember, we talked about maxing up the credit card. If you've got so much to use, then you have to be careful with what you've got. So if you can calculate how much, that's the whole idea of a budget, or your food intake for the day, say, and are you going beyond that and putting on weight, etc., are you running the risk? So our sense of budgeting, I think, is important.
So if you look at our current credit card debt, it's not a good sign.
No, personal debt is way too high. But that's because we're going to grow and it'll and inflation, and then it'll be cheaper to pay it off because borrow against the future. So there's 2 degrees. If we keep going with past observed temperatures and they accelerate, our children and our grandchildren, this was from the Climate Council, one of their slides just to show just what it might be like even in 90 years' time if we don't do something about it. That means turning around emissions and hopefully temperature. So this is the reduction in emissions we have to do to keep within these bands of 2 degrees or 1.5. And the longer we wait here across the bottom to reduce emissions, then the harder it's going to be to stay within these safe boundaries. It's going to be much harder to come down. The area under the curve is already going to have exceeded it. and that was from 2 years ago. And world emissions really haven't started reducing in any way as yet. So the IPCC carbon budget report said that we have to have a 1 in 3 chance of not exceeding the 2-degree target. We've got 790 gigatons of carbon that we have to play with, less the emissions up to 2011 of 510, leaving a budget of 275 gigatons from then on. Is under the best case scenarios. So people have done this accounting of what the budgets are, and you can graphically illustrate it that to date we've released so much, and we've had 1 point something degree of warming, or probably after the spike we might go down to just under 1 degree average above long-term averages. So much added since 2000, and our carbon budget remaining to not push us above that. And this is the amount of fossil fuels that are left in the ground. To 745 gigatons of fossil fuel reserves of the top coal, oil and gas companies, and over 2,000 gigatons in estimated remaining fossil fuel reserves from other sources. So that's why we say that 80% of coal and oil and that has to stay in the ground if we want to stay under our 2-degree budget, and that's why mines like Adani, Carmichael's are quite a crazy idea. Flogging off to someone else to burn our carbon, because it's all adding to this carbon budget.
But still being approved.
So if that's 80% stay in the ground to have a 1 in 3 chance
Yeah.
of not going over a 2-degree target.
Yes.
I think it was a 2 in 3 chance
Chance
of
of-
not going over. It was 1 in 3 chance of exceeding.
Yes.
Yeah.
So a 2 in 3 of not
Going
going
over
over
it.
a 2-degree target.
Yes.
I mean, that's just hopeless,
Well, it's quite tight, and we're not making a lot of effort to stay underneath
isn't
it.
it?
You wouldn't, if it was Russian roulette, you wouldn't take
No,
that
so
side.
it's interesting that we're framing our discussion by that. Like, it's interesting that we're allowing our discussion to be framed by.
And Paris did support the 2-degree target, and yet the people like this think that the probability of succeeding and keeping below the 2-degree target are very low. The 90% chance of emissions so far. This is someone, Rapok, 2013, unpublished. See, this is a 66%, but that means we've only got this amount of emissions. But we'll probably actually won't be able to stop it at just a few hundred gigatons more of emissions, and we'll end up using twice as many. So we probably only have a 50 or less % chance of staying below the 2-degree. And then if you get tipping points coming in before that, even if we can really rapidly reduce emissions intensities, we're still going to get to 2 or plus degrees. So a lot of people think that there's no way we'll be able to turn things around below about 3 degrees, even with a lot of effort, and depending on the tipping points. So
Mars still isn't an option, is it?
Not this decade.
So this really is a critical decade for doing something about it, and it really need to be doing something now. But unfortunately, we're already over halfway through this decade, and that's why the Climate Change Authority a few years back suggested that Australia increase its targets to 19% by just 4 years' time, and 40 to 60% by 2030, by 14 years' time. But I'm not sure that we've got the policies in place to be replacing our coal-fired power stations and our vehicle fleet and others in any big way, changing our farming practices. So let's look at the health impacts now of climate change, because we're mostly health professionals and interested in that. And in fact, not only that, but it's probably an area of leverage that you can have different political leanings, but we all want good health for ourselves and our children. So it's an area that we may be able to agree on, even if you have different economic and political views. And there is quite a lot of evidence there. Certainly they're not randomised controlled trials, but there's over 1,000 papers on health and climate change in peer-reviewed journals. And there's research that covers the risks, the costs, co-benefits of mitigation, resources. So that's, and resource requirements, that's 1,000 on health and climate change, not just climate change, this is health and climate change. Certainly a lot of them are projections and commentaries as well as, but there are a number on changing in allergen levels, as we see with warming temperatures and ozone, concentrations, and so people actually have been measuring these, and we do know that there are health impacts. It is evidence-based. And also there's some that are already apparent, others that are not yet clearly identified, and some predicted in the future. So we can already see the upward trend in annual average heat days that have led to deaths and hospitalisations, and I've got a slide or two to illustrate some of those figures in case histories. And of course an increase in number and severity of bushfires coming earlier in the season. October in New South Wales a few years back, which was very early on, very unusual to be so early. Usually it would be December, January. Rise in foodborne diarrheal diseases, air quality, ozone formation, aeroallergens, increase in allergic disease, mental health impacts, extreme weather events, which is what we think of when we think of climate change, floods and fires, and of all the weather-related disease. But also there's been shifts in mosquito-borne infections, and of course we're worried about Zika virus, and it's again quite complex. We do have more travel, warming world, and people are cutting down forests and living closer to forests and closer to wild animals, and that's probably the vector for some of our infectious diseases as well. Bats being displaced and having to fly to find homes close to cities because they don't have as much bushland farmers killing them, and they can have closer contact with humans, and then we're at risk of infectious diseases from human impacts on the natural world. The Climate Commission has put quite a lot of effort into a report here, and has calculated that up to 15,000 deaths from heat stress alone have occurred in Australia, and these are some of the risks. That dengue fever could reach all the way to Sydney with a 2-degree warming.
It used to be in Melbourne.
The cane tones will get here faster.
I think they will. That's a photo of Brisbane floods in.
Wow.
That's the city centre Eagle, the Eagle Pier, Eagle Street Pier. There was markets usually along there. People walk along just under there. Just a few years ago, the big floods that we had, and bits of people's jetties and wharfs floating down the river from their boat jetties. So we've certainly seen impacts of more severe cyclones and flooding in Queensland in the last 5 or so years. 78% of the flood was declared a disaster zone. 35 people died, and it affected surgeries. That 1,400 elective surgery cases were cancelled, and the deployment of staff and destruction of GP clinics, and then of course cuts and bruises as well as then the mental health concerns as well, with people losing properties and taking years to rebuild their lives. In other parts of Australia, bushfires are more of an issue. Not such a problem in Queensland. We struggle with cyclones instead and floods. Health costs, degraded air quality, and this is an estimate of 8.2 million per annum, which is contributed to by bushfires, not only with transport fleets, but bushfires can give peak loads of particulates and float around for days and affect air quality, as well as the personal destruction and tragedies and mental health that goes along for years afterwards. So since 1850 there's been more than 800 deaths in bushfires. The big Black Saturday ones many years back, 173 lives. And after the Ash Wednesday fires, there was found that a huge number of the population was suffering a reduction in their stated mental health due to increased alcohol use, depression, PTSD, etc. Back to another example of heat stress. These are the projected days above 35 degrees in Australian capital cities. And this isn't projected in 2008, that's what actually was the reality. So when days get above 35 degrees, it depends on the humidity, of course, and the wind and the pressure as well. that can impact not only on your comfort zones but the ability to work outside and heat death in the elderly. So Darwin, how livable will Darwin be? It's already marginal, I think, but without air conditioning. It's great. That's right. It's all right. I grew up in New Guinea, so I know about heat. But heat waves do kill, and the big one in Europe, 70,000 dead, Russia 56,000 dead. In India last year, 7,000 dead and 1,000 in Pakistan. In fact, the deaths in Pakistan, the heat wasn't as high as it was in a neighbouring province, but they had almost no wind and they had higher air pressures, I think I remember reading, and it was just intolerable. They had about 1,000 people die over the day or two. It was only about 41 degrees and they had 43, 44 in a nearby province, but with more wind and less humidity. So it isn't straight temperature that we can go on, it's more complex than that. But heat waves do kill.
Why was Russia so bad?
They had fires and the buildings aren't designed for it, and it was many degrees above their normal maximums.
People acclimatise. And so if you're acclimatised to heat, your physiology changes, you're better at sweating, you're better at conserving salt.
And knowing to drink too in the house.
And there's a whole lot of cultural stuff around it. Whereas, so if you're a Russian not used to heat waves, it might only get to what people in Brisbane might think is a nice warm summer afternoon. But they're all going to kill over. There's another context.
Vodka, keep going.
So this is just a projection in a Garnaut climate change report, 2008, as to with no climate change, there's a sort of the deaths we'd expect from heat waves. But if the worst case scenario and temperature goes up a lot, the number of deaths could be many thousands more every year. Food and waterborne diseases, the rate of notification of salmonella increases even with a half degree warming, and food poisoning. Flooding affects Cryptosporidia and Giardia. So there's going to be a lot broader issues. Allergic disease is interesting. Just a few degrees warmer and allergens seem to multiply and cause more efforts too, mixed with ozone in the atmosphere from car pollutants and things. And there's an irritant as well and amplifies the effect of the allergens. So it's not so likely to kill people unless it triggers a bad asthma attack, but the morbidity rather than the mortality. That's the word I was looking for. Thank you, Peter. So hot temperatures in themselves in urban areas with car transport, etc., increase ground level ozone, which is not good. We want it up in the upper atmosphere, but it's not so good at ground level. And of course, mental health issues, a lot more suicides, a decrease in annual rainfall by 300 millimetres associated with 8% increase in suicide rates in rural New South Wales as farmers struggle to see their livelihoods, their stock dying and having to sell up the property, the family farm. Occupational health, people who work outside, there's going to be a lot more dangerous days, and it's going to affect productivity as well for those unacclimatised, as Peter was saying. So climatised, it's different. There'll be less days that are dangerous to be outside, but unacclimatised, there'll be a lot more days that are dangerous to health to work outside.
Well, actually, even acclimatised people, there is a limit. Because we have limits to our physiological capacity to acclimatise, and when you hit those limits, then those days are going to go up. Liz Hannah's doing a little bit of work on that at the moment, but there is a ceiling beyond which Homo sapiens will
Yes, because our body temperature and if the external temperatures, and we can't lose heat. Yeah. And I suspect there's going to be a lot of areas in the world that are already very hot areas. I was joking about Darwin, but a lot of Middle East and parts of Asia that aren't at high altitude, that I remember being in India and it's 46, 47 degrees anyway in summer in a lot of the places. If it goes up to 50 something, you just can't work, you can't live really.
You've got Sherwood's work that models that perhaps 50% of the land surface of the Earth will become uninhabitable by I can't remember the number, 2050, 2100, if climate temperature goes up at the rate it's going up.
Yeah, as well as other bits that are flooded and So we're going to have a lot more, which segues into this, a lot more people moving from areas that they can't grow crops on and it's too hot to live in, or there's climate fighting over scarce resources. So stopping the boats is going to be much harder in 20 and 30 years' time if we don't do something about climate, if you want to stop boats rather than care for other people in the world. And in fact, it is an ethical issue, climate change. We need to be aware that these are cartograms. These are the countries that are releasing the carbon dioxide. These are the impacts of the US and Australia on health impacts. The estimated mortality is going to be tiny in the countries that are, look at England as well, and UK, huge, and the US. Where Africa hardly produces any of the carbon, and look at the projected deaths for Africa. So this is not only about generational ethics, this is also about much broader ethics. And therefore, we'll hear from Jane about population later, the population of Africa is projected to increase by another 1 billion people over the next 30 years. They're going to have to go somewhere, aren't they? Surely they want to keep jumping across the Mediterranean. So the final section, responding to the challenge. What if it's a big hoax and we make a better world for nothing? That would be bad, wouldn't it?
Yes. Because somebody's going to lose.
Lose money. Okay, so the AMA is starting to get on board. They do have a climate change policy that DAA helped to write, even though they haven't acknowledged it fully, the first one, and they've brought out their new policy again, and with their current national leadership, they're on side, they understand. It hasn't always been the case, but Professor Howler does understand about the urgency and the health impacts of climate change, and that we, as a wealthy nation, need to show leadership. Because if we can't do it, then who can? And we're creating a lot of the mess. We're some of the largest emitters per capita in the world. And Australians will be affected as well. Australia, if you looked on that cartogram, our impacts from climate change are not that much different from our emissions. We are a dry continent and a hot continent. And Australia will be impacted greatly by climate change, with a lot more deaths and illness. It is a global health issue. For a long time, people perceived it as an environmental or economic issue, and very few understood that it's a health issue. But health is the human face of climate change, and not only is it important to understand it, but it's a way of leveraging to show everyone on this planet that our common health and common wealth is all interdependent and interlinked. So just very quickly, I won't go into this in detail because some of the discussion will be about what to do. We talked about mitigation or adaptation. This is a picture of the Broad Street pump. We have a history of activism. John Snow, for those who've done public health, mapped out and realised that there was an area that a dodgy company that were acting for their shareholders were collecting water that wasn't the best quality from the Thames and supplying it to this poor area of London. And he mapped out a whole lot of cases of cholera, and yet he couldn't get the authorities to take any action or to take him seriously from his research as a GP. So what he did is he went in the night and stole the pump handle off the Broad Street pump. So it couldn't be used and had to walk to the next pump, which he knew came from a different part of the Thames with cleaner water, and he saved lives by his act of sabotage. And
Do you realise that's a myth?
it's a good myth.
Well, that's a myth.
But he mapped it.
That's not the pump either.
No, it's not. But that's a much newer pump. But it's a.
That's really a myth.
No, he did map. No, he did map it.
He did the
He mapped it.
epidemiological work.
And he asked them to.
And because he was mates with the Lord Mayor, he got the Lord Mayor to send the constable round. So it's actually about who you know in politics. So the lesson for us is not that he went and stole the pump handle. The lesson is that as medicos, we have the power to exert pressure on authority to take the action that's required.
And he also tried to make contact with the something in Thames Water Company or something, but they weren't interested or wouldn't
They
listen.
weren't interested. And then there's another guy whose name, a reverend somebody, who then did some more epidemiological work and discovered, in fact, that the contamination didn't come from the Thames, but actually came from a infected nappy that had come from somewhere out in the country that was tracked into a cesspit, and the creek through the cesspit drained into that basin, and so it actually came from a dirty nappy chucked into a cesspit.
The plot thickens.
Yeah, but the palm of the hand is a good story.
Yeah, that's a good story.
So just a few more slides and then we'll get into discussion. So one way to sell it is that there are co-benefits for us to change our lifestyle, that we shouldn't look at it negatively. We've got to give people hope. This is where the adaptation comes in that will help with mitigation, showing the interdependence and linkage of these, that by getting out of our cars, we can decrease obesity and reduce emissions. And in fact, our fossil fuel lifestyle is not a particularly healthy one. So there's more reasons in climate change to reduce our dependence on fossil fuels, because they're labour-saving devices, and we weren't really designed to save labour all up on your bikes. A comment there about cattle and methane. Probably should be eating more kangaroos or going more vegetarian or because there's health benefits cutting down on bowel cancer by having less red meat, and particularly processed meats. So we really should be looking at win-win situations as a way of leverage, coming as health professionals and those interested in health. So this is that glass half full, half empty, greatest health threat or greatest opportunity. I'm sure it's both. Without action on climate change, heatwave deaths, etc., road deaths. But if we act, renewable energy, well-insulated homes, local seasoned fruit and veggies, etc., cycling. And one final slide. Obesity, air pollution, etc., compared to green spaces, sustainable diets, active transport. So my final slide, just a background about DEA aims to use the skills of volunteer doctors and students to increase the knowledge and influence of professional and politicians and broader society about the adverse health impacts that result from changes to our environment. So hopefully that's given you an overview.